those Iranian missile attacks over Israel at the weekend, and more specifically, the response to them, because it was so interesting to see in the groups of or the different air forces involved in it, including obviously the Israeli Air Force, the US Air Force, the RAF were involved, the Royal Jordanian Air Force were involved, the Air Force of Saudi Arabia was involved. I think that's an important thing to look at in our conversation. Not the only thing to look at, but to look at in our conversation about where we are at the moment in the Middle East and the threat of a wider conflict. There was also reports in the Times of Israel over the weekend that a Saudi diplomat had revealed or suggested, I'm not sure which, and again, this hasn't been confirmed, but it has been a view since October the 7th, but not the only one, obviously. But he was suggesting that Iran actively and decisively told Hamas to carry out October the 7th at the time that they did and in the manner in which they did, specifically in order to undo the progress that had been made on the process that's been called normalization, so more normal relations between Israel and other Arab states, clearly not Palestine, but other Arab states, that it would undo that work. Well, in a sense, that response to the Iranian missiles was an indication that it hasn't quite undone that work. It's not I don't think it's the main question at the moment. The main question is what will avoid this whole situation becoming a wider conflagration. And we also have, of course, the ongoing situation in Gaza, some more hopeful signs that food will get to those people who've been most deprived of it in the north of Gaza. The Erez crossing has started to open and food markets have started to be active again. But for those people, often children suffering from the worst malnutrition and near famine conditions, according to the aid agencies, obviously a very specialist kind of help is needed, not just normal food and food markets and the like. But all of that is the backdrop to what's happening as David Cameron, spoke to LBC's Nick Ferrari earlier today. Let's take a listen.
If you look at the scale of what Iran was trying to do, 110 ballistic missiles, 36 cruise missiles, 185 drones. It's sometimes portrayed, this attack, as a sort of drone swarm. But actually, the use of ballistic missiles in a state-on-state attack is a very significant move by Iran. Very dangerous, very reckless. Fortunately, it was an almost total failure. But I don't think it was justified in any way by reference to what happened in Damascus. But look, I think now the most important thing, the Israeli War Cabinet has been meeting. They have every right to respond, and you'd understand that as an Israeli citizen, you'd be thinking, my country came under attack, we must respond. We're asking them as their friends to think with head as well as heart, to be smart as well as tough, to recognise Iran has failed, and the best way to de-escalate this situation is not to attack back, but instead to focus on Hamas's failure to release the hostages and the failure to agree to a pause in the fighting in Gaza, because we badly need to get aid in there and get the hostages home. If you look at what the Iranian Revolutionary Guard has done, they are the people that have been backing Hamas, who carried out the horrific October the 7th attack. They are the people who've been backing the Houthis, bombing ships in the Red Sea, irrespective of what country they come from. So can I understand Israel's frustration with the IRGC? Yes, I absolutely can. Do I think Iran's response with this state-on-state attack was justified? No, it wasn't. Unfortunately, it was an almost total failure.
But it wasn't justified to bomb an embassy in Damascus, was it?
As I say, I'm not getting into what Israel has or hasn't done.
Those references to Damascus, but I'm sure a lot of you listening will know, but for those of you who might not, a location in Damascus, a building in Damascus was targeted by Israel just over a week or so ago, in which some commanders, Iranian commanders were killed, along with other people. Iran says it was a consulate. Israel hasn't accepted responsibility for the attack yet, and there is some debate around whether it was a consulate building, and therefore with diplomatic immunity. I think that's what David Cameron was rather avoiding there in that conversation with Nick Ferrari. Dr H.A. Hellyer joins me, Senior Associate Fellow at RUSI, specialising in international security and the Middle East. Good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
So we
Thank you for having me.
Oh no, my pleasure. We find ourselves then the morning after the repelling of those attacks from Iran, hearing all sides really, apart from Israel and Iran, calling for restraint. You've got China and Russia saying, go easy, we don't need a wider conflagration, and you have the Western powers saying the same.
Well, I think that what we urgently need and have urgently needed for the past 6 months are people and leaders pushing forward for de-escalation, which is why there have been so many calls for a ceasefire in Gaza, an ending of the bombardment by the Israelis, because there is the law of unintended consequences and things like this. When you continue a conflict like this, you risk regionalization of a scale that we really don't want to come anywhere near, and unfold the region into full-scale war. The Israelis refuse to heed any of these warnings going back for the past 6 months. The strike on the consulate in Damascus, I think, was incredibly reckless. And now the Iranians have now responded in what is also a reckless move. We need to find a way to de-escalate this. And I'm afraid the key to all of this is really twofold. One, recognizing that the rules apply to all of us, right? So when Lord Cameron says, I'm not going to get into what the Israelis did or didn't do in Damascus, but says that the Israelis have completely the right to respond, that's not playing by the same rules. We all play by the same rules, or they're not rules. They're simply hobbies. And the second is that the linchpin to all of this is Gaza. If we have a de-escalation in Gaza, if we have a ceasefire in Gaza, if we have the opening up of humanitarian aid into Gaza, I think that tremendously de-escalates and removes tension to a massive degree all across the region. And we desperately need it.
But those ceasefire talks have been ongoing, on and off, more on than off, really, since October the 7th, haven't they? And that, of course, involves both sides. You say that the linchpin is Gaza, and I understand what you mean. I think I understand what you say when you mean that. But, there are those from the Israeli perspective who might argue that actually the linchpin is Iran, and Iran is controlling Hamas, and Iran controlled when and what happened on October the 7th. And for that reason, if we talk, and Lord knows we all want to talk of a ceasefire in Gaza, we have to remember that it is a two-sided ceasefire that's required.
So there are several things. First, there's no confirmed evidence to suggest that Iran ordered the attacks on October 7th. U.S. intelligence has blown that theory out of the water. I did hear your report earlier on in this program, which attributed it to a Saudi diplomat, but I don't think that we have the evidence to suggest that.
Which I said.
On the contrary. I know, and I'm not saying that you presented it as otherwise, but the intelligence consensus, as far as I know, from within a security establishment myself, is that we don't have that confirmed in the slightest. In terms of the two sides sort of thing here as well, I think we have to be very, very aware of this. 30,000 plus have died at the hands of the IDF over the past 6 months. I'm not talking about treating Hamas as anything but a bad actor or a terrorist group. I'm talking about ending a bombardment so that civilians and non-combatants, the vast majority of those 33,000 that have been killed over the past 6 months, don't have to have more numbers added to that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I understand the asymmetry of this war, but it is important also, isn't it, to, and you are right to point to the numbers of civilians killed, and I mentioned the starvation in the north in particular, which is beyond awful. But that asymmetry brings some interesting things with it. It brings the asymmetry in the civilian casualties, of course, that's the worst element of it. But there's an asymmetry of responsibility as well, isn't there, often in conversations around it? Because the Hamas are embedded within wider Gaza, and Hamas are part of the solution, aren't they? Even though they're bad actors, as you call them, they have to be part of the solution.
I was being polite by saying bad actors, but I'm glad that you brought in the framing of responsibility, because this is really key to this entire conversation. The West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza, and the Golan Heights are all recognized by the UK, by the US, by the United Nations, by the international community writ large as being occupied territories, and that the occupying power is the State of Israel. The State of Israel is the occupying power with regards to Gaza, continues to be so, and hence is responsible for the welfare.
Which you know, don't you? They refute that.
I understand that the Israelis insist that it's quote-unquote sui generis territory, but this is completely against what the entirety of the international community, including, I say again, the United States and the United Nations, have made clear, abundantly clear, time and again, that the occupation began in 1967 and has not ended. And very, very clearly, they are continuing to be an occupation of the Gaza
So when
Strip,
Israel,
which means that
can you translate this for me? But can you just translate something for me? When Israel repeatedly says, we gave Gaza back to Palestine, Hamas runs Gaza, you say what? I mean, pre-war I'm talking, pre-October 7th, you say what?
I understand. So what they're talking about there is the quote-unquote disengagement policy that they underwent in 2005. This does not mean the ending of occupation. International law is very clear about occupation, what it means. It means effective control. Israel is in control of all of the borders of Gaza, air, sea, and land. Israel is in control of the population registry of Gaza. Israel is in control of everything that goes in and out. Israel controls completely 6 out of the 7 land borders
and
as well.
that amounts to an occupation.
In international law, it most certainly does, which is why even post-2005, even post this disengagement that Israel undertook, which is really just about them removing settlements that were illegal in the first place and had no business being there, they continue to be the occupying power. And if they're the occupying power, then it means that they are responsible for the welfare of the population that is there. So when you ask me what could they have done, differently, I say, what would they have done differently had October 7th been the result of a terrorist group that was embedded in Tel Aviv? That's what I ask. They have to.
They wouldn't have decimated Tel Aviv, is what you're suggesting.
No, they would not have decimated Tel Aviv any more than we would have decimated a town in the UK, even if there was a terrorist group that was embedded there. And this whole thing about embeddedness also is rather peculiar to me. Gaza is a very, very densely populated area. Of course, Hamas are going to be embedded within the population there in the same way that even in Israel, you have military installations that are in the midst of civilian areas as well.
I understand that, but just for a wider sense of things, the reality is the tunnels are not for civilians. The reality is, for the density that you describe, perhaps, civilians are put into danger by where Hamas place themselves.
Without question.
And they don't give them space in the tunnels to save themselves, do they?
I did preface all my comments by saying I don't think they're a good actor, and I'm being polite.
Okay. And can I ask you, I mean, I accept what you're saying about Israel having a responsibility, and I absolutely accept what you say about the need for ceasefire. How do we get to that point, though, where Israel, whether we like it or not, is going to look across at Hamas and say, well, they're still chucking rockets over to Tel Aviv?
I would flip this, to be honest with you. These rockets don't damage remotely not the existence nor lives in Israel when you compare with what's going on with the Israelis bombarding Gaza.
But they should still stop
if we want.
If there's a ceasefire,
If it's a ceasefire, it's a ceasefire. I'm very happy for all of this to stop, but I don't think that we can remotely claim that in order for an end to a bombardment that has taken, again, more than 30,000 people's lives, the vast majority of whom are civilian, that we need to put conditions on that. No, the condition is stop now, stop killing people. Because if we keep on doing this, first, more people die that are innocent and it's unjustifiable. But also we run the risk, a very real risk of this spilling over into wider regionalization. We already got a taste of what that looked like over the last few days. I frankly think that thus far, the region got quite lucky. I expected it to be much worse 6 months down the line. I wouldn't have presumed it be possible that the recklessness that has led the 6 months of this bombardment could have possibly gone to 6 months, that, within a few months people would have pulled back. So we have to really think about this in a wider context of, do we want this region to sort of explode into wide-scale war?
Which we don't, obviously.
I would hope so.
Yeah. Brief, if you would, as a final answer, an answer to my final question. All these calls for restraint from Israel in response to what happened over the weekend, what's your sense of whether they'll show it or not?
Well, there are two factors here. One is the United States. The second is Benjamin Netanyahu. When it comes to the United States, they've made it very clear to the Israelis, look, we've got your back. We're not interested in this getting any worse. We're not interested in this becoming even more of an escalatory model. Please, quote unquote, when I say quote unquote, because I think this is a bit inaccurate, but quote unquote, take the win. Barely anything happened. You need to just, you need to calm down right now, because this will it's very easy for this to spill out of control. So the question then becomes, does Benjamin Netanyahu think that the United States is serious about that the United States will not back him if he does yet another reckless move, and that the United States will actually pull back in some way? And I don't know the answer to that question. I do know the answer to the question of would the United States back or not back, but whether or not Netanyahu will make that assessment, keeping in mind also he's an incredibly opportunistic, cynical politician. And again, I'm being polite. This is widely recognized in Israel, outside of Israel. He has prosecuted this war over the past 6 months, this bombardment, I should say, on the back of trying to save a political career. So in that regard, all bets are off in terms of how reckless Netanyahu is willing to be in terms of a response to the last few days.
Okay, thanks very much indeed, Dr. H.A. Hellyer, Senior Associate Fellow at RUSI, specialising in international security and the Middle East. A couple of questions, really. Do you think Israel should show restraint in the face of those 100 or so missiles that were sent over, that were fired over Israel over the weekend? And what should Britain do? We saw full-throated support and help in defence at the weekend. Should that continue?